So we're going to now turn over the floor to Zach Sautner from the Frankfurt School, who's going to talk to us about measuring exposure to climate risk sort of in settings where it's not quite as easy as for the real estate, just to look at where it's located and then combined with the NOAA model. And I say easy here is kind of tongue in cheek, because I know there's a lot of actual data manipulation that goes in to actually kind of doing all these shapefile merges, etc. But I think, as we discussed before, there's lots of other assets and asset classes out there where it's even conceptually less obvious what are the types of things you'd be looking for. So Zach, thanks for giving us the time.
Pleasure. Let me start by thanking Johannes and Teresa for the opportunity to present my own work in front of so many promising and interested PhD students. So, any ideas you have, feel free to note them down. Let us know either at the end in the panel session or by email. Feel free to do this. So let me start by saying that I could only write this paper thanks to my co-authors, which are Lawrence van Lent, Greg Wilkoff, and Ruishan Zhang. Ruishan was also a PhD student here in Frankfurt. He's now in Shanghai. All the others are colleagues of mine at Frankfurt School. Let me start with two observations. Both of them resemble what Johannes was saying in his introduction. First observation, climate change has very multidimensional effects on companies. There are downside and upside effects. Some firms will benefit, some will suffer. We tend to focus on those that suffer, but there are firms that will benefit. And you see some pictures here of firms that may benefit, at least those on the left side. So there are opportunities for some firms, and of course others will be affected more in terms of the downsides that we tend to think of, transition or regulatory risks, and physical effects of physical changes in the climate. Now, the other observation I want to start with is that there is a big debate, and we've heard this, whether investors pay sufficient attention to climate change and whether the exposure of firms to climate change is priced in different assets. So now, the reason why this debate is not settled yet, or at least one reason why this debate is not settled yet on whether climate change exposure is priced and how, has to do with the fact that it's very challenging to measure exposure to climate change. Now, on the left, you see that this is a point that is made from practitioners. On the right, you see that this is a point made by academics. Now, practitioners say, according to Bloomberg data, that here in hedge funds, that one of the key challenges they face related to ESG investing is a lack of quality, consistent data. The researchers say, Johannes and his co-authors, in this research overview of the climate finance literature, that, I quote now, on the empirical side, there's substantial scope for improvements of the measures of climate risk exposure in different asset classes, and in particular for equity assets. Now, why is the quantification of firm level exposure so challenging? Why do these practitioners and academics say this? Well, first of all, we've heard this also from Johannes. Climate change is highly uncertain, and the effects on firms even more so. We don't know how the climate will eventually change. We don't know whether, how, and when policymakers will tighten regulation. So uncertainty about the climate, physical, and regulatory risks. Now, what's more is that it's likely that the effects of climate change will be varying across firms, will be very heterogeneous, even within industries. And that's an important point that we are going to make here in this paper, that it's very difficult to classify climate risk exposure based on industries only, because if you take a given industry, you will see within that industry, there are going to be winners and losers. Now, the result of this quantification challenge is a lack of common practice in terms of how we can quantify firm level climate change exposure. Now, some measures exist. You have probably seen some of these measures. I've used some of these papers, of these measures in my papers. Now, one measure is emissions data, either absolute emissions or scaled by sales or assets, emission intensities. Now, what's the problem with this measure? Well, it only captures a very limited aspect of climate change exposure, the extent to which firms are exposed to regulatory or transition risks. And on top of that, the problem is that this data is only available for a very limited and selected sample of firms. We find that only about half of S&P 500 firms report information on their carbon emissions, because that's voluntary data that you do not have to report yet. Second, and that's important to remember, not all emissions are necessarily bad. There are emissions of some firms called climate enablers, which are considered actually good from a social perspective. Think of emissions that are generated by construction firms that are making houses better in terms of isolation, so they eventually reduce much more in terms of carbon emissions related to heating. Plus, another big problem with emissions data is that it primarily reflects the past instead of the future. And of course, what we care about in financial markets is forward-looking information, expectations about future emissions, and that is very hard to get. There's also data by professional data vendors. ISS and Sustainalytics construct measures of carbon risk. Now, they go beyond emissions data. They're reviewing documents by firms, they're interviewing firms, and so on. Now, the problem with these data vendors is, first, they have a selected sample. The sample is constructed based on demand of institutional investors, what firms they hold, what firms they care about in terms of getting information on the carbon risk exposure. It's also just available for a limited amount of time. And I have a new paper on this. It actually turns out that a lot of this data is rewritten ex post. So we show this for asset 4, that asset 4 data is rewritten ex post, which means that if you think about investment strategies and you use the current rewritten data, you may find outperformance that investors would never have been able to generate ex ante with information available at that point in time when they made the investments. So there are limitations related to existing measures. So we try to make progress in terms of introducing a method that identifies firm level, and let me emphasize that, firm level exposure to climate change, and we construct this measure from earnings conference calls. Now, the nice thing with our measure is it's available over a long period of time, relatively long period of time, 2002 to today. We're regularly updating it. It's available for more than 1,000 firms, 10,000 firms in the cross-section from 34 different countries. And we create a measure of exposure that allows researchers to separate opportunity, physical, and regulatory shocks related to climate change. If you want to use the measure, it's available publicly. You have the link here. You see it also on our paper. Everyone can use it, and we try to also make a little service here to the profession in allowing other people to do exciting stuff with this. What we show in the paper, I'll also give you a bit of information later on, is that it's likely to be a relatively valid measure of exposure. It exhibits in the cross-section and in the time series variation that is reasonable, that aligns with reasonable priors. I'll say more about this in a second. So we're trying to create a measure of climate change exposure at the firm level. So what we essentially do, what we intuitively do, is we identify the proportion of a conference call, which is an earnings call between management and financial analysts, and capture what fraction of that earnings conference call discusses climate change related topics. So it represents a measure of the firm's exposure to climate change as perceived by the participants in these conference calls. Now, the terminology, especially the term exposure, not to be confused with how we think about exposure traditionally in finance, is consistent and follows the logic of a paper by Hassan and co-authors, and one of the co-authors is Lawrence, my co-author on this paper. For example, the Hassan et al. 2019 is a paper in the QJE where they use a similar methodology in order to create a measure of political uncertainty at the firm level. And there are other papers that they have written using this methodology that I'll mention later on. Now, The nice thing with this measure is it allows us to create a measure of overall exposure, of topic-based exposure, opportunity, risk, related to regulation, physical risk, but also it allows us to more explicitly measure risk and sentiment. It's not included in this presentation, but essentially what we're doing is we're scanning these conference calls. We look at individual sentences that contain bigrams, word combinations related to climate change, count them, put them relative to the overall number of bigrams. That's our measure of exposure and of the subtopics. And in addition to this, what we also do is we do the same exercise, but now condition on the presence of risk or sentiment words in the sentences where these climate-related bigrams pop up. Right? So this data is also available, measuring more narrowly climate-related risks and sentiment. So before we look at the results, let me answer three questions. Why do we use conference calls? How do we identify keywords related to climate change? How do we separate multifaceted effects of climate change? Let me turn to the first question. So why do we look at conference calls? Now, conference calls are extremely important in financial markets. There are important dates on the investor relations agenda. They take place on a quarterly basis, and there are a key arena where management and key market participants, analysts, investors meet each other. So it consists of management presentations and Q&A sessions where the analysts can ask management. Now, the advantage of these calls is, first of all, they are less susceptible to greenwashing by management. If you were to do the same exercise that we do here on CSR reports or press releases, you're more likely to get a bias measure because these documents, CSR reports and so on, are more likely to be greenwashed by management. Second benefit is we're able to have very broad coverage. We have an international sample, many years I said this, and so have less concerns about sample selection. So how do we identify climate change from these earnings conference call transcripts? So you may say, well, textual analysis, so let's just use a pre-specified training library. Now, you could do either, like Hassan et al. 2019, in this earlier mentioned QGE paper, compare political textbooks, news with non-political text, create a training library, and run that library then on the transcripts. Alternatively, you could also say, in order to scan these documents, I take a shortcut. I'm just defining a set of words, and I'm scanning these documents for the presence of these words. So they do this in two papers where they look at whether Brexit or COVID-19 are discussed in these transcripts. Now, the problem is both of these approaches are very hard to apply when identifying climate change. We tried that. We figured out it's not working well. So here's why. It's first related to the training libraries, and it's second related to the conference call transcripts. Why the training libraries? Well, the problem is climate change reports that you may use as a training library, like the IPCC reports, they include a lot of context, a lot of content related to other areas, science, economics, technology, which makes it extremely hard for researchers to identify climate change word combinations, bigrams. So therefore, these training libraries don't work well here. Second, climate change experts tend to talk very differently from conference call participants about climate change. So conference call participants may ask very specific words, may ask very specific questions about particular power plants, particular investment projects, particular technologies that would not show up in the same way in these training libraries, but are of key importance for investors to measure exposure to climate change. So now, luckily, we didn't have to come up with an invention in terms of what to do to solve this challenge. In political science, there's a highly influential paper by King et al., which uses a keyword searching algorithm to tackle such problems. Now, what's the intuition and face validity of that measure? The intuition is very simple. So basically, the idea is that when mentioning general climate change terms, people also like to use detailed climate change bigrams that are hard to specify ex ante, right? So in order to capture these hard to specify ex-ante climate words, we want to use that it's likely that these more complicated, more specific terms are likely to be used in the context where the more general terms are being used. So what we do is we define as an input an initial list of 50 climate change bigrams that are without doubt related to climate change. For example, the word climate change, or the word combination, its bigrams, global warming, renewable energy, carbon tax. Then our machine learning model does the following. It learns additional bigrams by basically checking to what extent other bigrams are showing up in sentences in which these initial climate change bigrams appear. So we create an additional set of bigrams out of the training model. Now, let me just give an example. We feed as an input the term electric vehicle. Now, when going through these documents, and in particular documents where we know for sure that electric vehicle as a bigram popped up, we find that other related words, other related bigrams in proximity were, for example, Tesla battery or hybrid plug. So clearly words related to electric vehicle, but words that would be very hard to ex-ante specify in an initial list of bigrams. Other example, renewable energy, right? So some of the words you may come up with, nuclear power, but others may be more difficult. For example, event Fukushima, or if you look at specific projects, locations related to climate change exposure, right? It would be very hard probably to identify initially words such as Kibi Wind, Joaquin Valley, or Kotlin Power. At least we wouldn't have been able to come with them, up with them. But it turns out that these are important climate change bigrams that, so our machine learning model tells us, arise when people talk in these conference call conversations about climate change topics. So now that we have the list of bigrams, of course, one question is how do we separate a measure of overall exposure, which captures opportunities and downsides, everything together, into the three separate unique sets of climate change bigrams? Well, the answer is very simple. We are using the same approach as before. The only difference now is when we define the initial bigrams, the initial list of 50, we are now making three sets of initial bigrams that very clearly contain bigrams related to opportunities, regulatory risks, physical risk, or I should rather say regulatory exposure, physical exposure. For example, right, we then find, thanks to our machine learning mechanism, that when we feed the model with air quality, we get as an output, as an additional bigram that seems relevant and related, EPA regulation. When we feed the model with sea level, we get island coastal, large desalination, and so on, right? So we have one set of bigrams that contains everything, and then we have three subsets, three unique subsets that contain bigrams related to opportunities, regulation, and physical aspects in the climate change domain. So formally, what our measure of climate change exposure at quarter I of at quarter T of firm I is, it's basically the number of bigrams scaled by the total number of bigrams that appear in our set of climate change bigrams. That's basically what we do. So we're scaling by the total number of bigrams because some conference calls may simply be longer than others. So the measure is available on a quarterly basis, because on a quarterly basis these earnings conference calls take place. So you can use them on a quarterly basis. In many of our tests, you will see in a second, we're using annual data. Apart from creating this measure of overall climate change exposure, we're also using and constructing these three subsets. So all we do then is we're replacing the set C with the topic-specific sets of climate change bigrams. So let's get to the results. So we start with describing and validating the data, because we think once you introduce a new measure, it's highly important before you start all kinds of apparatus and asset pricing tests to show that the measure makes sense. So here's some validation in the time series. So you see here how climate change exposure across all firms, now here measured still on a quarterly basis, has evolved over time. So you see from just eyeballing the figure that exposure has increased sharply over time. There was a multi-decline around the Doha Summit 2012, which was largely considered an unsuccessful summit. And then there has been renewed increase in climate change exposure since the Paris Agreement in 2015 and the Trump election in 2016. Now, this is the overall measure. The picture for the opportunity and regulatory exposures looks very similar. What looks very different, and it's a good result in terms of making sense of the data, is the measure of physical exposure. You see, the measure of physical exposure does not have a clear trend. It also tends to be lower on average than the other exposure measures, and it's highly volatile. Right? So I think that's something that is very plausible. So what we also see here is that if we look at the measure of average and standard deviation of climate change exposure across industries, that the firms, the industries with the highest exposure listed here make a lot of sense, a lot of intuitive sense. So based on our measure, the top industry in terms of climate change exposure is utilities, electric, gas, and sanitary services. But you also have coal mining, construction, and so on among the top 10 industries. Construction is also not really surprising. I just recently learned that in the construction of cement worldwide, there is 4 times as much CO2 emitted than by all airplanes that are flying around the world together. Now, what I want to point out here is that there is a huge standard deviation within each of the sectors, which is exactly the point we want to make, namely that it's important to look within industry at the firm level in order to properly quantify climate change exposure. Now, this is what we find here also. So we do a simple variance decomposition. We're using our measure of exposure and the submeasures, and we're regressing it on time, sector time, and country fixed effects, and try to absorb the non-firm level components and see that what's left, the pure firm level component, is huge. Right? So the largest part, you see that here between about 70 and 96% of the exposure measure is really at the firm level. It also makes sense that it's the firm level component largest for physical exposure, which is really firm-specific idiosyncratic things like related to relocation, for example, while, for example, regulatory aspects or opportunities are likely to be less at the firm level and have more a common sector, for example, component. Now, the good news is also that there is some limited relationship with alternative measures. Carbon intensities, for example, they're positively related to exposure. They're not related to physical exposure. That's exactly what you expect. We also see, by the way, firms with larger carbon intensities, they have more opportunity exposure, more regulatory exposure. Regulatory exposure makes sense because of carbon taxes and so on. Opportunity exposure, we were first surprised, but it makes a lot of sense because it turns out, for example, there's a Lauren Cohen paper recently that some of the biggest carbon emitter in the world are also the most innovative firms in terms of green patenting, right? And we also have other examples in the paper illustrating that those firms that produce a lot of emissions seem to also at the same time have a lot of opportunities, for example, because they have also lots of renewable energy projects, which again highlights it's important to look at the firm level and at the specifics with regards to these aspects. There's also a relationship, but it's only a modest one, with the ISS carbon risk rating. So that suggests that our measure does, to some extent, capture other aspects. We validate the measure further, showing that regulatory climate policy aspects are correlated with our measure, are not correlated with physical exposure, which is exactly what you want. It's related to regulatory exposure and overall exposure. To the contrary, we find that extreme temperatures are not related to opportunity or regulatory exposure, but it's as a t-set of 162, so it's not statistically significant, but there's some relation with physical exposure, which is exactly what you would predict. That's what extreme temperatures should affect. Remember, this is measures here at the country level, so there's a lot of noise in this. So it doesn't necessarily pop up all statistically significantly here in the last test. Now, what we do is we show that our measure is related to a set of very important economic correlates that theory predicts should be related to climate change exposure. Now, we start by showing that the time series variation in media attention to climate change, Johannes's paper, is an important variable explaining exposure. So we find a positive association of their measure with our measure, so higher exposure at the firm level when there is overall more attention. We find that for regulatory and physical shocks, we don't find that to opportunities, which I think is sensible because, as was explained by Johannes, their measure that we use focuses mostly on the downsides and kind of negative sentiment. We also find that firm level institutional ownership and climate change exposure are correlated in a negative way. So it seems to be that in firms where there's a lot of climate change exposure, institutional investors start selling or underweighing these firms in their portfolios. Now we find this relationship, this negative relationship across all the measures, which indicates that institutions do fail to some degree to differentiate between the different sources of climate change exposure. Now we also look at the role of mandatory ESG disclosure across countries and actually find there a non-result, which we find is sensible because you don't want ESG disclosure to unduly affect our measure of voluntary information exchange at these conference calls, and that's exactly what we find. So there doesn't seem to be effect of ESG disclosure. Now, I think it's important to also show, because we're in finance, that there are some value implications of the measure, which is exactly what we find. So we find that after 2011, in the second part of the sample from during which exposure increased quite a bit, you've seen that earlier in the figure, we find that firms with higher regulatory exposure to climate change have lower firm valuations. We don't yet find that opportunities are priced. We don't yet find, or we do not find that physical risks are priced, maybe because these risks can be better insured. And again, we only find these effects after 2011, which again, as I said, is plausible in terms of the dynamics we've seen. Now, an analysis we recently added was looking at how COVID-19 has affected our measure of exposure. And I think here we have some very interesting result. There seems to be some crowding out, right? It seems to be that COVID-19 has shifted the attention away from climate change. And I think this is a big risk we're facing at the moment. Because it's shifting away the pressure from companies. You see in figure B, this first happened in China. So you see a decline in the climate change exposure measure in the first quarter of 2002 in the calls in China. There's not yet an effect in Europe and the US because we all know the COVID pandemic hit these countries and the firms later. But then in the second quarter of 2020, we see exactly the same effect also in the US and in Europe. So let me conclude. We hope to have made progress in addressing a key challenge for investors, firms, and regulators, namely quantifying firm level exposure to climate change. Our firm level climate change exposure measure combines the views of key stakeholders. It captures opportunity, physical, and regulatory shocks. It offers broad coverage, and we've made the data available for everyone to use it. Now, Johannes, I have another slide with my perspectives on the literature. I don't know if you want to have me discuss this now or later in the panel. I'm also happy to stay and make.
Yeah, why don't you just give a few sentences now, because I think we're going for a break, so we can go 2-3 more minutes, and then we can go deeper into sort of the specific ones, during the panel, which I think is going to be valuable.
Great. Okay, so let me start by saying I think this is an area that really matters. It's the first time that I work on projects where I believe I can make a difference for my little kids as well if I'm spending these hours on my projects. I think an important insight that climate change affects finance. But importantly, finance also affects climate change. If with our contributions in this literature, we can reallocate or help making reallocations from the brown to the green firms, I think there's the potential to do this also through research. Then I think we can also help fighting climate change. A lot more work needs to be done. I think the risk is a little bit that some of the low-hanging fruits gradually have been picked. There's still a lot of questions, and I have a list of potential questions here. You can have a look at them and we'll get back to them later. So let me conclude by thanking you for listening to my presentation, and I'm looking forward to any questions or like you may have.